Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Connections, Demystifying Asian and Pacific Islander Bias. I'm going to remind you to please have your phones muted and your microphones muted at this time so that we won't have any feedback during the presentation. So please mute your cell phones and your mics at this time. So I want to introduce myself to you. I'm Stacy Boyd, and I am the Interim Chief Diversity Officer at the University of West Georgia. And a lot of people that I meet ask me, well, what exactly do you do? So my job is to be a thought partner and thought leader around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the University of West Georgia. And we're providing this webinar because we want to increase our capacity to care for and to include all members of our West Georgia community. Those are two of the things that we value at the University of West Georgia. That's caring and inclusiveness. So as we begin, please remember to keep your mics muted. Please mute your mics so that we don't have feedback on the webinar. All right, so let me provide you with a few logistical points so that we can have a very good experience as we continue with the webinar. Please remember to keep your mics muted. All right, especially those of you who are calling in by telephone. Okay, let's see here. Right. For those of you who would like the option, you can turn on captions, and that setting is located at the bottom of the screen if you're interested in reading the captions as we continue with the webinar. Right. And you can also play around with the way that the screen is laid out. If you wanted to just see the people or see the person that's speaking, you can play around with the settings by clicking on the three dots located in the right upper corner. All right, so for those of you who are here for extra credit, there is a link in the chat that has been released, and you will need to complete that extra credit form it's a Google form, and you'll need to complete that, and we will send that information to your professor. So you'll need to let your professor know that you attended, and we can send that information, the confirmation, to your professor. But you do need to fill out that Google form, and the link for that form is in the chat. All right. So throughout the webinar, we will be interacting with you in the chat room. So we have some moderators in the chat room, and they will be posing poll questions and opportunities for you to interact with us. So please answer the questions, and it's not a test. It's just an opportunity for you to interact with us. All right. And there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of the webinar. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of the webinar after all of the panelists have presented. And to ask your question, please type it in the chat window, and our chat room moderators will ask the question for you. All right. And you should be able to see on your screen our panelists, the names of our panelists, and they are Dr. Sarah Molesworth Kenyon, who is the Associate Professor and Director of the Microbiology Certificate Program, Dr. Ihor Pedani, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and Asian Studies and the Asian Studies Minor Coordinator, and Dr. Yan Yang, Associate Professor in the Department of Education, Technology, and Foundations. And we'd like to give a special thank you to our chat room moderators and also to our online experts. And you can see their names on your screen. That's Mandy Campbell, Rod McCrae, Brett Reichert, and Deidre Rouse. And we thank them so much for their help and participation with this webinar. And I especially want to give special recognition to Deirdre Rouse, for organizing and creating this opportunity for all of us. And we thank you so much. And we also have some other partners at the University of West Georgia who have worked with us, and you can see them on the screen. We just want to recognize them. All right, so again, the purpose of our webinar today is to increase our capacity to embrace and include all members of our West Georgia community. And over the recent months, we have read about and seen that more people are reporting anti-Asian and anti-Asian American bias. And we can understand this bias to be a type of xenophobia. And xenophobia is a dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries. And we're hoping that by providing you with the historical overview of Asian and Asian American bias, and providing you with information about COVID-19. And one of the things that you'll learn is, in fact, COVID-19 is not the name that we should be calling it. But we're hoping that with providing you with that information and then offering you some personal perspectives about this type of xenophobia, that you will be able to go and be more informed and be an ally for those who may be experiencing xenophobia. All right, so to start our presentation or our webinar, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Padani, who will give us a historical overview of Asian and Asian American bias.
All right. Thank you, Stacy. Well, my name is Ihor Pidhaini, and I'm a historian in the Department of History of China. And I'm also the director of Asian Studies at the University of West Georgia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint, and in it I'm going to talk about two things today. First thing I want to talk about is identity and Chinese American, and Asian American identity. And the second thing I want to talk about is the kind of history of the Chinese in the United States. And so I'm going to do this in about 9-10 minutes. So this is general, and it is going to touch upon a lot of different issues. So this is, and so what? Can you now all see my PowerPoint slide?
Dr. Badani, it sort of minimized. It looked like it started to minimize. Are you able to reopen that?
I will reopen it. I was warned by my students you'll have trouble with the. Okay, let me just present now and a window, and let's see which window it is. It is see if I can do that. There we go. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so can you all see that then?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so two things, identity and history. And bear with me if this is general. Now, in any discussion of Chinese Americans and China, we'll be talking about China as a touchstone. And for this makes it complicated because there's both the nation and the civilization. And so for Chinese Americans, you're looking at a heritage question. But for people who are not Asian Americans, they're looking at this, okay, what's the connection with China and the United States? And so you bring into account things like currently the trade war and cyber war and different political systems, and also competition for a status in the world. So those are all things that are on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is the issue of Chinese heritage. And I've got images here of someone using chopsticks to eat, I think, ginger, and Confucius. And so the idea there's a culture and a way of doing things and behaving stuff which is different from the West and from the United States. So these are things that impact any discussion. Now, and before I go into the history, so identity, as one thing we look at, and I use these three categories: China, China America, and Asian American. Being Chinese is something you're born with, or for the most part, you were born with, or someone your parents or your grandparents came from China. So this is a question of citizenship or heritage. Chinese American, and this is the addressing of many of the cases we're talking about here, is there is a kind of, you have a heritage that is Chinese, whether you were born there and came over as a child or as a college student, or whether your grandparent, one of your grandparents came over. There is a connection to the heritage. So it's a hyphenated Chinese American, but American is the central aspect of your identity. And this is a term that's from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, Asian American is a more inclusive term for all Asians, or for the East Asia, South Asia, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia. And it's a political term that was begun in the 1970s, but it's a way to kind of connect. And from an outside perspective, especially outside of East Asia, the difference, telling Korean Americans and Chinese Americans apart is very difficult. So these are categories where someone who's here, who's Chinese American or Asian American, identifies. And similarly, Japanese American, etc., among various groups. Okay, so this is just kind of understanding the complexity of identity. And if we look at the history, now, Chinese came to the United States really in the 19th century, and in no large number until the 1840s, 1850s. Before that, there were very few. In the census of 1840, there were 4 Chinese in the total census of many millions. They come because of the gold rush and because of the building of the transcontinental railway. And so they come over as labor. And this is fine for the people who employ them, people who brought them over, or the people who, things are fine when there's money, but when there's a recession that occurs, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of kind of pushback. And so there's this kind of birth of anti-Chinese racism. And this birth of anti-Chinese racism actually has very extreme forms. And so we see this both illegally, as in the top left-hand corner of the LA riots, where you had between 17 and 20 Chinese were lynched in LA, and many killed, and the whole town burnt down, to legal exclusionary movements. At first on the West Coast, where Tacoma and Eureka and other towns kicked the whole community, kicked them out of the country or out of their city. And this eventually, however, had no impact. It had no impact until the idea of Chinese labor gets pushed into the East Coast and the South. And so this has to do with various movements of labor. And what happens is you have this Chinese exclusion movement, and it's labor and the Democratic Party pushing against this at the time. And so you have one of the kind of famous, infamous articles in the bottom, the Chinese exclusion, meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asian coolies. The argument was that Chinese were a form of slave labor. And this will eventually lead up to what is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, because the people in Washington start to get impacted when the votes start to come in, and the movement moves against Chinese and then Asians in general, and they pass this law in 1882. So this is a break from the whole movement of the abolitionists and Reconstruction period. And so 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act keeps further Chinese immigration out for 10 years, and it'll get re-upped until it's permanent in 1904. And then you have also Chinese cannot become citizens. And this is just one of many laws passed at the federal level. But the Chinese will, however, mainstream or will make their way back into American civilization, if you like, through a number of things. And I've put up the most important means, and that's through the legal means, because they don't have voting rights. They have almost no rights, but they have the rights to the court. And the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, is one of the three amendments that basically attempted to equalize African American and white American rights in the United States, is going to be used by Chinese in courts and their lawyers to argue against the treatment they've been receiving. And I've highlighted the two important passages. Below, we have that the state cannot deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And this comes up in a court case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Chinese person and company which fought it wins because the Supreme Court interprets person means that it's not citizens, but persons all have to have equal protection. So you can't treat Chinese differently under the law. You can't treat any race differently under the law. And that is in the 1870s, and then, in 1886. And then the first part, all persons born of or naturalized in the United States become or are citizens of the United States. The Birthright American Citizenship Clause is accepted as precedent by the Supreme Court in a very famous case in 1898. And so this begins the kind of transformation of Chinese status in the United States. The next big thing that happens is the World War II. And in this case, Chinese Americans join in fighting in World War II. And so there's a lot more treatment of equality. The Chinese Anti-Exclusion Act is removed, and things get a bit better, but not for the Japanese Americans with the internment. There is this all goes down to about 1965, where various changes, and with the Immigration Act of 1965, you have the removal of what was a quota system, and you have a kind of equality in the system in place. Okay. Now, today, just to conclude, there are still problems today, and there are two, I think, sets of problems that I would ask you to pay attention to. First is the idea that the Chinese have dual loyalty. They have to choose between China and America. And as that image shows you, that's not the case. Chinese Americans, there's a rich heritage and are proud of their heritage, but also firmly rooted in American identity and American and the freedom and equal rights, etc. And the other thing is that Yang Yan will talk about are the racist acts which are happening. They're part of the history, but they've reappeared, and they may be minor compared to what happened in history, but there's always a fear that it goes out of control. And as you see this poster, a very famous one that's just appeared recently, I am not a virus, I'm a person. So realizing that COVID-19 is not Chinese. Now I've included various references, newspaper articles and interviews. There's one, George Takei is in one of these, and various websites and articles. And there's also, if you want to go, PBS has been doing wonderful documentaries for years and years, and some scholars. And I'm sure our moderators can tell you how to link to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Padani, for giving us that historical overview. And again, you just sort of touched the surface for us, but provided us with some solid information that we can begin to think about some of the current issues that we are dealing with related to Chinese and Chinese American bias and xenophobia. All right, so now that, and I want to remind everyone that in the chat room is, there will be questions. We'll be interacting with you in the chat room. So please feel free to answer the questions that you see in the chat room. They're not, it's not a test, just an opportunity for you to interact with us. And please remember to keep your phone on mute, or to keep your mic on mute. And we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar. And they will send the link with the sign-in sheet for those of you who are wanting extra credit. There will be a link to the sign-in sheet in the chat room as well. So now that we've got a brief overview of some of the historical issues related to Asian American bias, we're now going to turn to Dr. Sarah Molesworth, who will talk to us about the virus and some of the scientific information so that we can better understand the bias.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, I just want to dispel some of the myths that are going around about the science. So I've got about 5 points to talk to you about. So the first one is this myth that did the coronavirus just appear in China in 2019? Now, of course, that is false. No virus just appears. The notion that a virus can spontaneously generate has no scientific basis. The reality is that just like you and me, a parent virus is required to produce a new variant. We call this the progeny virus. So this is the natural process of evolution. Coronaviruses have actually been studied by scientists since the 1960s. So again, it doesn't mean that these viruses originated at that time. It just meant that scientists had the tools to study them in the lab during the 1960s. So some basic facts about coronaviruses. The family of viruses are called the Coronaviridae, and they cause both upper and lower respiratory tract infections. So they're associated with many diseases. They go from the common cold all the way up to the severe acute respiratory syndrome that we're seeing in humans at the moment. And there are actually hundreds of different coronaviruses out there, and we've known that they're present in many different animal species, and they've been there through evolutionary time. So these coronaviruses are not, as a family, a new thing. So in the animals, they'll cause anything from respiratory to systemic symptoms such as gastrointestinal issues. And just to let you know, the family Coronaviridae, they get their name from the crown of proteins that surround the virus particles. So that's the basics for you. So the next thing I was asked to discuss is this incubation period that everyone refers to. And of course, we are still learning many of the details about this new variant coronavirus. So at the moment, it's believed that the incubation period is around 2 weeks. Now, just to remind you, incubation is the time that it takes for an infected person to develop symptoms. But incubation periods are always reported as an average. So for some people, it will be shorter than 2 weeks, and for some, it will be longer than 2 weeks. And you must remember that all viral infections, when they infect the patient, they'll follow a path of disease which is defined by the individual patient. So that's because the original health status, the age, and even the gender of the patient will cause their individual immune system to respond slightly differently against the virus. So it's a very individual battle, virus to host. As we gather more information about the new virus, we'll eventually be able to fully describe the disease that this new one is causing. So next, we want to look at why is this virus so infectious? So to let you know, viruses are transmitted from person to person by lots of different routes. They can go from the environment to a person. So examples of some routes are through food, through body fluids during sex or intravenous drug usage, through touching an infected person, or touching a contaminated surface, even something as simple as a door handle. This particular coronavirus is so infectious and spreading to so many people because it's being transmitted via what we call the respiratory route. And this is one of the most efficient routes that viruses can use. So the virus is spreading and it's exposed to many people simply by a single breath, okay? Anyone who's infected, whether they're showing symptoms or not, and if they're not showing symptoms, that's the term asymptomatic. They're shedding millions of virus particles from their lungs, okay? As they sneeze, as they cough, talk, or even, as I said before, they're just breathing. So that's why potentially the whole environment around an infected person is potentially full of coronaviruses. So you can imagine a 6-foot bubble around each infected person that's filled with virus. And lots of people are asking, well, why this 6 foot? Why is this magic measurement? Well, we know that when you breathe or you cough or you sneeze from the lungs come these micro droplets. And those micro droplets of moisture
You peed on what?
be carrying the virus. And these are so tiny, these droplets, they float through the air for about 6 feet before they settle. So that's where the 6-foot measurement comes from. So going on to the next talking point. Why is social distancing so important presently? So social distancing is being used to try and keep individuals out of the infectious zone. So that 6-foot bubble, right? And that zone is being produced by anyone who is shedding virus. So remember, you can't see if someone's infected by coronavirus. So we have to basically assume that everyone that we come into contact with may be infected. So stay 6 foot away and therefore stay out of the infectious zone. The stay-at-home mandate is working twofold to stop the spread of coronavirus. So firstly, anyone who has symptoms will remain at home, and so they won't be contaminating the environment for others. So no door handles, public transport, community areas. Secondly, healthy people that stay at home are thus limiting their risk of exposure by coming into contact with someone who's asymptomatic. The use of face masks, if you go out, is very important because we now know that it is providing a physical barrier against the spread of the virus particles in those droplets I was talking about. So it's going to be a barrier from anyone who's asymptomatic. If they should cough, their face mask captures their droplets. If you're healthy, then your face mask will capture any droplets from the environment and lower your risk of infection. So that brings me to the last talking point, which is trying to dispel this myth about labeling the virus as a Chinese virus. So everyone out there at the moment is using the wrong name for this virus, okay? Yes, this is a coronavirus, but remember, that's the name of the family of viruses that this new variant belongs to. Anyone that's calling it COVID-19, that's incorrect as well, because COVID-19 is the name of the disease that the virus is causing. There's only one correct name for this virus, and that is SARS-CoV-2. Okay, how did it get this name? Well, virologists named it for the parent virus that it's thought to have evolved from. So genetic analysis has demonstrated that this new variant coronavirus is most closely related to the virus SARS-CoV. Okay, now that one you do know, that is the agent of disease that causes SARS. Okay, SARS, remember, is severe acute respiratory syndrome. So this new syndrome is also leading to that symptom of SARS. It's the deadly pneumonia that we're referring to for COVID-19. So hopefully that sums up some scientific facts for you. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Stacy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Molesworth. So we're going to have to get in the habit of calling this SARS-CoV-2. So we appreciate that very much. And even though, you know, that might seem like a light or insignificant thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, the way that we talk about things matter. What we call things matter. And what we don't want to do is to stigmatize anyone that is a part of our community. And again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So what we want to do now is move to have a talk by Dr. Yang, who will talk about the current anti-Asian and Asian American bias from an educational and personal perspective.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yan Yang. I'm associate professor of educational psychology in the Department of Educational Technology and Foundations. And thank you all for being here today. And thanks for the panelists to make this happen. And so first of all, I want to make sure that you can see my screen. So I just kind of pop up the PowerPoint that I have. So please let me know if it's working or not.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So I do research of motivation in diversity education. So as Dr. Petahani and Dr. Mosworth mentioned, that this coronavirus situation is really not the source, but I would say it's really the incubator or the accelerator of this recurrence of anti-Asian bias, because it's not new. It happened in history, and throughout history this had happened. So I'm first of all showing you a group of numbers from a chronological order, and I hope that you can see a trend here. The trend is that the numbers are getting more and more scary. So since the inception of this virus, according to Dr. Mosworth, it would be SARS-CoV-2. Since that virus occurrence, there has been report of 1,000 cases of racism and xenophobia against Asian Americans, and this number had been climbing, and as of 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks before, which is April the 9th, over 1,400 reports have been associated with these anti-Asian racism acts. And the racism or the anti-Asian climate takes many forms, from something that's more light, like a microaggression in public, being called names, like Dr. Sarah Mosworth mentioned about Chinese virus, China virus, Wuhan virus. Those are more bearable, but the most recent unbearable ones would be physical violence that cause serious injury to these individuals. On the slide, you can see on the left, down left corner, this 23-year-old boy, a student, and he was bullied by a group of perpetrators and punched him in the face, caused a lot of blooding in his face and a lot of bruises, as you can see on the picture. And a woman on the top, on the down right corner of the slide, you can see it's a black and white picture. It was basically a woman, Chinese looking, and she was just taking out her trash in Brooklyn on a typical Sunday night. But she was ambushed, and this person creeped up to her and dumped sulfur acid on her, caused serious burning and injury to her. And there was also one case that was you probably have already read it, which is a woman with her 2 children. They were all stabbed by this gentleman who thought they had the coronavirus while they were shopping at Sam's Club in Texas in March. So all these are really horrendous, and imagine that happening to anyone of you or anyone that you know. It's really very, very hard. And as Chinese Americans, it's very hard to really bear this. And I feel bad for all the Asian Americans, because Asian Americans, we share some very similar facial features. So because of the labeling and the misinformation in the public, so we became the scapegoat of this pandemic, and a lot of Asian Americans feel very unsafe these days. And personally, I do not feel comfortable for example, for my own husband, even though he is American and he does not speak any Chinese. And I no longer feel safe for him to go for grocery shopping or anything, because I don't know if he would be the next one being attacked, being backstabbed, for example. The other emotional turmoil Asian Americans are going through is really the anxiety. Dr. Mosworth talked about how wearing a mask can be really a physical barrier, help stop the spread of the virus. Unfortunately, as we know, in the beginning, we were not encouraged to wear the masks unless we were sick. Whereas in China, as many of us still have connection to, people are not allowed to go out unless they have masks on, because if you don't have masks, statistics shows that you have 70% chance of being infected in public. But we had to see this virus playing out first in China, now in the US, causing so many tragedies, so much death, is really very, very nerve-wracking and very depressing, in addition to the compromised sense of safety. So as a result, a lot of Chinese are actually buying guns these days, not Chinese, just like Asian Americans in general, because we just don't feel safe. We have to defend our loved ones. A woman was at the gun store, and the store owner asked her, "Why are you buying a gun?" Because normally Asian Americans are not big fan of guns. She was tearing up. She said, I have to protect my daughter, because there had been a lot of reports on breaking-ins on the Asian stores, restaurants, and private homes. They also have to resort to other security systems like ADT, Ring, and across the country, as far as I know, a lot of Chinese have had to unite and form these mutual help militant groups. So if one family gets attacked, then the others around in the neighborhood area can go in and interject to help them out. So, but along with the suffering Asian Americans are going through, I'm very glad to see that Chinese Americans are really taking responsibility, taking charge to help out the people working on the front lines, including healthcare professionals, police officers, people working in the post office and grocery stores. So I was just curious when doing this presentation, preparing this presentation, I did a very quick tally about how much money was collected based on grassroots efforts. Basically, Asian American, in particular Chinese American, they would, take money out of their own pockets to donate, to get the protective gears to help out the people on the front lines. So a quick search, which is in no way exhaustive, generated this number, which is almost $2 million were raised based on these grassroots efforts, and over about 700,000 N95 masks, surgical masks, all these protective gears and ventilators were donated to these different places. Please keep in mind, it's more than a money issue. It's also a lot tireless work of hours of getting the gear from China, from other sources that's available, pack them up, deliver them manually to these facilities, like in Atlanta area, like Phoebe Putney Hospital in the south that was overwhelmed, like Grady's Hospital that is dealing with a lot of patients, and a lot of them are not really publicized on the website. So the number I got was only some official reports, but I know of many friends of mine, many people that I know, they have been really working very hard to do the best we can to help out our frontline workers so they can be protected, because before workers fall, they're going to suffer. And the restaurants are also making donations, and education is also key, because we believe that we're all one family. So back to the anti-Asian bias and how to stop racism issue. I'm very glad to know that a lot of organizations, higher institutions, are taking the measure to take a stance to denounce racism, and also there has been a lot of efforts to expose these kind of nasty and unacceptable anti-Asian harassment behaviors, because we need to call them out. So there's hotline that's established, a website to track these cases, and also post them to mainstream outlets. Also, there has been a website built up to design different class assignments for educators to incorporate into their syllabus, so they can educate their students on this issue. And really, all of us can be anti-racist ally and unite. And lastly, checking on your Asian friends and loved ones to make sure they are okay. And thank you very much. And the last two slides are just references that I generate for the presentation. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yang. I appreciate so much the information that you provided to us. So for those of you who are joining us on this webinar, you can pose a question if you like. You can ask a question by typing it in the chat room. And the sign-in sheet, if you are interested in getting extra credit for attending the webinar, they will again send the There it is. Now, it's in the link for you to sign in. So one of the ways in which language matters in terms of preventing anti-Asian xenophobia and bias is, as Dr. Yang said, and Dr. Molesworth said the same thing, if you call it the Chinese virus, then what you're doing is stigmatizing people who were Chinese. And unfortunately, I have heard people say things like, well, I guess I'm not going to, get any Chinese food, but that has nothing to do with the virus. So the way that we talk about things matters. What we call something oftentimes dictates how we feel about it. And so we want to be very careful to be accurate and not to stigmatize any one community as a result of this virus. Also, we want to make sure that we're being allies. And what that means is that if people are giving misinformation, or if they are being aggressive or inappropriate toward people, we want to be the ones to step up and say, actually, that's not true, right? That's not true. We want to make sure that we are reacting to and providing facts. And as they say, facts over fear, right? Facts, not fear. So we want to make sure that we are not contributing to this anti-Asian and Asian American bias by making sure that we are not spreading rumors and misinformation. Okay, and there's a question: have there been any reports of instances of anti-Asian bias at the University of West Georgia? And as far as we know, there have been no reports. Brett, did you want to say anything about that?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would just confirm that as far as we know, we have not heard any reports of Asian bias from our Asian students. But I would also say that most of our students largely stay on campus because they don't come here and purchase cars. So their experience may not be a true reflection of what students in metropolitan areas are experiencing who are easily able to move around the city.
Great. And thank you very much. And let me introduce our experts who are in the chat room. They're not the panelists, but they have a lot of information that they can share with us as well. And they are, you just heard from Brett Reichert. He is the Director of International Student and Admissions Programs. We also have Rod McCrae, who is the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And we also have Deidre Rouse, who is the Director of Diversity Education and Community Initiatives in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. And in particular, Deidre Rouse organized the panel and really, I would say, moved mountains to make this happen in a short period of time. So those are our experts who can also respond to questions that you have. So the question came up again about how does language contribute to anti-Asian bias. So let me answer that again. And then any of our panelists or experts in the chat room, feel free to chime in on this as well. And that is the way that we talk about something, what we call it matters. The names that we give to things dictates oftentimes how people will respond to it. And so we want to make sure that we are being accurate in the way that we describe the virus. We don't want to call it the Chinese virus as if Chinese people are the only ones that are affected by the virus, or anything like that. All right. So we don't want to stigmatize that group. We want to call it SARS-CoV-2. All right, because that is the factual name, SARS-CoV-2. All right. So the way that we talk about things and the words that we use to describe things can contribute to xenophobia and bias. Did any of our panelists?
If I can offer one add-on to that idea, is that
this is Rob McRae from the Centre for Teaching and Learning. I also teach in the English department as well as a lecturer. And so one thing I'd heard from a student, and though there were no reported cases of outright intimidation or bias shown on campus, there have been some sort of issues of microaggressions that seemed playful, but actually had kind of a barb to them. So one example was a student who said that in the same way that Dr. Kenyon had referred to and Dr. Young had referred to, that during when we were still having class back in January, one student had said that some of the other students in their class would sit away from them a little bit and jokingly said, well, I guess I have to watch out for you. You might be carrying that virus. And that would, completely, they thought they were being funny, but that student most certainly read a sense of like, oh, you're treating me differently because of something I have no control over.
Exactly.
Can I just share a few? There has been actually a history of how we name these viruses can cause human tragedies. For example, the Spanish flu, we all know Spanish flu, but at the time, the flu was rampant throughout the globe, but only Spain at the time they reported. So we nailed down to say it's a Spanish flu, and it caused a lot of prejudices, discriminations, and chaos. That's why afterwards, I think there has been a consensus in the globe that we are not going to name a virus based on a particular region or ethnic group, because it may happen to happen somewhere, but like Dr. Mosworth mentioned, the viruses have been around us for ages and they evolve just like humanity, we evolve.
Very good, thank you. Thank you. You know, one of the things that I have also tried to be careful of when I go out, because I do have to go to the grocery store like everyone else, is that I am trying to, even though this is a virus that is contagious, I am trying to intentionally remember that these are people. And what I mean by these, I mean everybody that I'm coming into contact with. And as Dr. Mosworth said, we want to try to maintain social distancing. But even though we are maintaining social distancing, a social distance, that doesn't mean that people are not people and are not humans. And so I'm trying to be very intentional to guard my own issues about not wanting to catch the virus, but remembering, even the people who come to drop off food at the house, they're wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask, but that's a human being that's delivering food. And one of the things that I recognize too is that that person has the privilege, or I have the privilege, not to have to go out and deliver food. It's a privilege that I get to stay home and order food. And so I want to try to remember the humanity of the people who are out working, who are delivering food, who are at the grocery stores. And I'm not just talking about those who are Asian or Asian American, but I'm talking about all human beings. I'm just trying to make the point about remembering each other's humanity. Okay?
You're so right, Dr. Boyd. I just wanted to mention also, social distancing does not mean social isolating. Yes, yeah. Physically, we have to distance each other just for safety measures, but we need to reach out to the people, the seniors, the people who have pre-medical conditions, the people who need our care, our just greeting, just to check on them, see how they are doing. So we can be social distancing, but we can be social connecting.
Right. So the moderators in the chat room, are there any other questions? They were kind of going by quickly and I couldn't read everything.
Yes, Dr. Boyd, there's a question here that came from, I brought it back to the top of the list and there was actually questions came in as it happened, but was asking if any of us believe that this will continue to negatively affect Asian businesses even after all of this dies down.
I think, none of us would want to try to predict the future. And one of the reasons why we are trying to have webinars like this is so that, again, people will respond to facts and not be overwhelmed by fear, because you cannot, just because you're eating Chinese food or you are in a Chinese restaurant or a Chinese or Asian business does not mean that you will catch the virus just because they are Asian or Chinese. That's what Dr. Kenyon was trying to get us to understand about how viruses work, right? So you can catch it from anyone. And so we want to continue to try to spread facts, to give information so that people can operate from a place of facts rather than of fear. Any of the other panelists want to respond to that?
Maybe, I guess I'm Chinese, maybe I'll just chime in a little bit in on this topic. I know like a lot of Chinese restaurants have been affected, like Dr. Boyd said, but I think almost all restaurants in the US right now have been affected just because, you know, we have stay-at-home orders still in many states and we're practicing social distancing. However, you know, the interesting statistic I read about the other day was that because Asians, because of what we have seen that happened in China, so we are taking extra precautions. The percentage of Asian Americans being infected and die from coronavirus infection in the US actually are phenomenally insignificant. I think it was actually less than 1%, you know, of that. So.
And of course, we
Dr. Boyd, there's a question in the chat where someone is wanting the thoughts on the purpose or thoughts behind wearing gloves. Of course, now in some places masks are required, but what are the thoughts, or is there any controversy behind wearing gloves?
I can answer that one. There's no real controversy. It's simply you wear the gloves if you're in a situation where you do not have a hand washing facility available for you. Okay, so the healthcare providers, they're wearing their gloves as normal routine, but if you're going out as an individual, you don't necessarily need gloves. Okay, again, if you're going to wear them, they're going to be a barrier for you if you're out for a prolonged period of time. But if you don't have any gloves, all you have to remember to do is thoroughly wash your hands, okay, and not touch your face.
Thank you. So can the moderators in the chat room let us know what other questions or comments are there?
Certainly. There's a question here from, so it says, I spent a gap year in an Asian country where the use of masks was entirely normal, even before the virus evolved. Have there been cases of discrimination against individuals who are wearing masks on campus before they were recommended?
We were, as a university, we were already closed down before they made the recommendation about wearing the mask. We were not, closed down is not the right word. We were already online, I should say. And as far as I know, we do not have any reports of any anti-Asian bias in that time or more recently.
And I'll add to that too, that had added a comment before when Dr. Young was talking, saying that grocery shopping makes me nervous, even with my mask on, people stare. So these are the sort of aggressions and microaggressions people from Asian communities and backgrounds experience daily.
Mm-hmm.
And let me add to that, this is Deidre, let me add to that, of course, unfortunately, those things are happening to individuals in the Asian community or for those who look Asian, but wearing of the mask due to the microaggressions and things that exist in the African-American community, there have been instances where some African-American gentlemen have been arrested because they were wearing masks or either escorted out of the store, even though that is being a requirement to enter some businesses at present.
Thank you.
And a question about language came up. Does the language that we use to help, does the language we use to otherize, in quotation marks, Asian Americans and make it easier on average to commit these acts of violence?
I would have to agree with that. Again, the way that we talk about things indicates and allows us to act in particular ways. So language that otherizes people, yes, allows for that type of behavior to persist. So.
From what steps need to have been completed prior to it being safe to move away from social distancing and closer to life before the pandemic? Dr. Kenyon?
Okay, so what they're looking for is a situation where we see the rates of infection start to plateau and decrease. And then at that point, you can set up a situation where any new cases that are diagnosed, you have a tracking system to identify everyone that they came into contact with. So this is similar to, you may have seen the apps that are being used where someone who has symptoms will be flagged in the app and then everyone notified that has come into contact with them. So they're looking into all of these ways to document who has been exposed to any new cases. But you can't do that kind of tracking until we start to see moving past this plateau into a decline in the number of cases that are being tested as positive. Then at that point, once you have the tracking in place, you may be able to start returning people back to work. That's what the scientists are saying. Okay.
Thank you. I'm pausing to give the moderators an opportunity to let us know what other questions are in the chat room.
I'd ask about that there was once a law on the Georgia books that prevented mask wearing, and I just posted a link to the news article that refers to the fact that Governor Kemp on April 14th waived that mask law so that there were no accidents, so nobody would get ticketed for wearing a mask. And then a question came in, and I've lost it in the list here, bear with me. What is the probability of a re-emergence or second wave this fall, as we're beginning to hear of? From Brett Reichert.
So the probability that it will re-emerge in the fall, was that the question?
Yes, and I know that Dr. Fauci with the White House has also referenced that this could end up being a cyclical virus, kind of like the flu.
Yeah, at the moment, we just don't know. There's no way to predict. With influenza, we track that virus all year, and we know that the patterns it moves through, but we have decades of data on influenza to tell us that it will re-emerge at the same time every year. Again, we just haven't got the data to make that prediction right now.
And then a follow-up question for you, Dr. Kenyon. If you're practicing social distancing and someone sneezes near you, could it go past the 6-foot barrier, that bubble?
Well, theoretically, yes, it could. If someone sneezes and there were already air currents, so say if a fan or air conditioning was working in the favor, then the droplets could be transmitted beyond 6 foot. Okay, again, that 6 foot is our average distance of protection. Okay, so if someone were to sneeze directly on you, you would want to go and wash your face, wash your hands, change your clothing, to take all precautions.
Thank you. And there's a question in the chat box. What is offered at UWG for students, faculty, and staff to become more educated about bias? And how are our future students who are in the education department being prepared?
Deidre, do you want to talk about our implicit bias training that we offer?
Sure. In the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, faculty and staff to become more educated in CDI, which is our acronym for Center for Diversity and Inclusion, you can follow the information in terms of different seminars that are available, but specifically there is an implicit bias training that is 1.5 hours to 2 hours, where we have roughly probably 10 to 18 people on campus who received a trained or trainers training, and we can come out to your classroom, to your specific department or student organization to tailor a bias training for you, because it covers so many areas in terms of bias. Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Boyd?
No, I thought that was great. And we're also looking to, well, I guess I do, but we're also looking at providing more online opportunities for people to get information about bias and equity, inclusion. So even when the campus reopens, we're still hoping to provide some of those opportunities.
There's one question, the last question that I'm able to see is UWG looking into rescheduling the spring graduation? To our knowledge, that is what they're hoping. We have not received a final word yet. To our knowledge, it is postponed, but of course those graduates will receive their degree via the mail. So just look for information from the university.
I also posted a follow-up to that. There was a message from the president on March 24th where he addresses that. So that link that's now in the chat box also leads you to that announcement.
And I think the very last question as we wrap up is, how long does it take for the particulates that the SARS-CoV-2 clings onto or settle? How long does the virus live outside the body?
Again, we're still gathering data on that, but at the moment, scientists think that a contaminated surface, also known as a fomite, can remain contaminated for several hours after those droplets have hit. So door handles, phones, seats on buses, you know, if someone has infected them, contaminated them rather, then they could remain viable virus particles for several hours.
All right, everyone, we are actually a little bit past our time, and I really appreciate so much our panelists and also our online facilitators and all of our partners. Thank you very much for having a jam-packed hour of information. And we want to just remind everybody to stay safe, operate from a place of knowledge and facts rather than fear. And you can see on the screen our contact information. So since we're all working virtually, probably the easiest way to get in contact with us is through our email. And you can see our email addresses on the screen. Thank you so much.